All right, so we will get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Amy Clausen here with the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum, and welcome to our weekly webinar. Today we have our Managing Director and Curator, Sarah Kaufman, back with another presentation. And this time she let you choose what you wanted to learn about with an Ask the Curator session. So several questions were submitted ahead of time, and Sarah will go through those questions. If there's others that might pop up during the presentation, you feel inspired by some of the information she's giving, feel free to type them in the Q&A box or the chat box there, and we'll see if we can get to them at the end. We might stump Sarah with some questions, but we're always happy to answer questions afterwards as well if we need to do a little more digging. So I will turn it over to Sarah, and we will get started.
Thanks, Amy. All right, so thank you very much for attending today. And thank you very much to Emma, who is our student here from Brock University for the summer. She helped coordinate this session, so thank you very much, Emma. So why don't we just get on started and we'll go with it. I kind of have some themes there were a bit of themes for the talks. I'm just trying to get it to go to the next screen. There we go. Whoops. So the first theme that came out were there are a couple War of 1812 questions. One of them, one of the first ones here, it's about the Battle of Fort George that happened during the War of 1812 in May of 1813. So this person is curious about where the Americans landed when they came during the Battle of Fort George. And I thankfully got permission from Richard Merritt to use his drawings, because I think his drawings from his book, The Uncommon Ground, are really great for showing the Battle of Fort George during that day. So of course, you know, the American troops then head out during the fog, and they head out towards the lake. And at this time, the British soldiers who are at Fort George think that there's going to be an attack more down the riverway. They saw troops heading down the river on the US side, and so they assumed that perhaps down in Queenston again or along the shoreline there might be an attack. But lo and behold, the fog lifts early morning on May, and the troops are landing up along the lakefront. I'm trying to see if I have a way of, I know there's a way to use like a cursor so you can see things. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but the large black arrows show essentially where the American troops landed. And so it is between 2 Mile Creek and where the cairn is today that people see near the golf course. So you'll see the words lighthouse along the shore there. That is essentially where Fort Mississauga on the golf course is today. And so the other thing is you see the words Town of Niagara. There is also the road that shows a lot of houses here. That is essentially Queen Street. So if you follow that straight up, which is what you would do nowadays to get to where the cairn is, that is essentially, again, like I said, where the American troops come across. So they basically come across through town. And yes, there are people living in the community at the time, and they come through town and head towards Fort George. And the troops at Fort George eventually, sorry, they show a bit here. There is a brief American retreat, of course, in the morning, but then you can see the arrows as they sort of spread out and come across town and towards Fort George, as I said. And the British troops who decide to retreat at this time leave Fort George. They head down towards Queenston and then eventually up to Burlington area to meet more British troops. And so this is the start of the American occupation of Niagara during the War of 1812. An interesting little tidbit that some people don't know about is when the Americans started to pursue the British along the road to Queenston, which is the Niagara Parkway today, John McFarland, the McFarlands, there's a note that they were offering port and sherry, perhaps. I think it was definitely port to the American soldiers to slow them down and maybe deter them from chasing the British soldiers down towards Queenston. So it was just a little interesting tidbit about that as well. So that gives you a good idea of where the American troops landed during the War of 1812. It's a good question. So the next one is about Joseph Wilcox, who is, could be Ontario's first trader. So no, the museum does not have a picture of Joseph Wilcox. Unfortunately, I'm not sure of anyone who does. The image that you see here is an artist's drawing of the burning of the town. And let me just give you a little bit about Wilcox, because he's actually a very interesting character. And there isn't a book published about him yet. Now, Donald Graves wrote a thesis about him, which is excellent. And he had mentioned several years ago that he was going to publish a book about him, but I don't think he's got to that point yet. But I would look forward to it. We do have a copy of the thesis here. So if anyone's interested in learning about Wilcox a bit more, you're welcome to come and take a look. So Wilcox is originally from Ireland, and he came here and lived with a relative. I believe the name was William Wilcox, briefly. And then eventually becomes the secretary to Peter Russell, who was the Receiver General in Upper Canada. He lived out on the Commons. There's Peter Russell House, which later turned into the Indian Council House. This building no longer exists on the Commons, of course. But he was kicked out of the house by Peter Russell because Wilcox was making advances towards Peter's sister named Elizabeth. So he kicked him out of the house. And Wilcox decides to then obtain the patronage of Chief Justice Alcock, who is Peter Russell's political rival. And so he's with Alcock for a while, and then Alcock decides to leave Ontario, and so then Wilcox finds another patron. Of course, he's sort of trying to play the game of the social compact. So he's finding new patrons to gain more power, I guess, and notoriety in Upper Canada. So he does become a public official. He's essentially like an MPP of sorts for our area. And he retained a lot of support, I think, from the locals here, because he always made sure to vote and support measures that had local appeal. So, road constructions and such. And he was very careful about making sure that whatever he was voting on would be something that would be supported by the community. And but one of the problems that there was with him being in the legislature is that he was a huge supporter of Republican-style reforms, and so he valued loyalty to his country. He was a bit of an anti-monarchy mindset, and so he opposed the distant power over the colonies. And this was something that the social compact didn't like, and so he was cast out of the inner circle. Now, the interesting thing that kind of shows his personality perhaps a bit is that rather than trying to get back into the circle and to make changes that way and sort of gain favor again, he actually comes out the opposite way, and he criticizes these people, and he wants to be a part of their circle, and when he's cast out, he's very critical of them and really becomes quite negative. And he's actually arrested for libel a couple times, and actually imprisoned for a little bit too. The interesting thing too about Wilcox is, so with the War of 1812 when it happens, at the beginning of the war, he helps Brock to get the Native alliances. He's also someone who fights at the Battle of Queenston Heights with Brock and the British soldiers. So it's quite a shock when after the fall of York and the Battle of Fort George that we just talked about, he then tries to get the favor of the Americans. And really, I mean, this is, to me, when you read about the history of Wilcox, he does seem to be quite the opportunist. And so, it doesn't surprise me that when it seems like the tides are changing and it's becoming the Americans that are gaining ground in the War of 1812, that he tries to get on their side. And they align in beliefs too at the time too. So, he's held responsible by many for the burning of Niagara. And, there's many ways that people could look at it. He could have been quite bitter, ousted and ridiculed by residents who were still living in the community after the Battle of Fort George. They're still living in the community, and they see Wilcox and what he's trying to do. And the Canadian Volunteers are, harassing locals as well. So, I think out of his embarrassment and his anger towards the locals and the way he might have been treated, it wouldn't surprise me that he was the one who encouraged the burning of the town. An interesting little tidbit is he's buried in Buffalo, the cemetery there, in an unmarked grave, which is quite a fitting revenge perhaps for someone who was responsible for Niagara-on-the-Lake's destruction. During the siege of Fort Erie, Wilcox is killed by a descendant of one of the Butler's Rangers, actually. So it's kind of interesting, kind of the way how his life ended, and now he's buried in an unmarked grave in Buffalo. So this one is about Roger Shafe, who took over after Brock in charge of Fort George when Brock passed away. Shafe is a very interesting character. So in this question, they're asking about, he sort of had a bad reputation amongst soldiers. And I enlisted, I remember hearing about this as well when I did my research for the War of 1812 stuff. And so, but I did enlist the help of Rondell just to kind of get some clarity in what was being asked here, because some of the lineup of timing is a bit off. But so Shafe was in command of the 49th Regiment garrison at Fort George. So he's known as, a good administrator, but a very poor leader. And he's sort of a stickler. He's very strict. And they call him what was known as sort of a martinet. So he punished men really harshly for minor transgressions, and obviously not well liked amongst his soldiers. So in 1803, so this is quite before the War of 1812, and Brock is in the area, is in Canada at this time. In 1803, after a group of deserters had been rounded up, they learned of a plot by soldiers of the 49th they were planning a mutiny at Fort George. So, the mutiny was to kill or to lock up some of the officers and to desert to the United States. So Shafe knew that Brock was highly respected by the men and better able to quell the mutinous leaning. So he immediately sent word to Brock to come back to Fort George and to help out, because Brock was actually at York at the time. So Brock immediately came this way, and he acted on the information, and he arrested the ringleaders of the plot, who were immediately shipped to Quebec to undergo court-martial, and they were tried and sentenced. So the executions were by firing squad, and it took place in 1804. There was no such thing as a long shot execution. The firing squad stood 10 paces from their victims, who were forced to kneel on their coffins before being shot. So those who were shot were Sergeant Thomas Clark, Corporal William O'Brien, Privates John Rock, William Clark, that's with an E, the Clarks, Thomas Shugru, I might be saying that wrong, John Fitzpatrick of the 49th, and Private Thomas Kennedy of the 6th, and Corporal James Carroll of the 41st. So the last three of these men were actually deserters. So Shafe himself did not sentence these men to death, and the court-martial did happen in Quebec, and it was passed by Colonel John Vesey there. So it wasn't Shafe necessarily. I'll go to the next one here. This is always a popular question about the burning of Niagara. So this question is a bit open because it does say Niagara-on-the-Lake, and of course St. David's in Niagara-on-the-Lake was also burned in the War of 1812. So just to kind of quickly answer the last question there, which is about the residents being present during the burnings. Yes, many women and children were in the community during the burning of the town. they were only given a few hours notice, and in terms of the burning of St. David's, you know, it was a very quick thing as well. Most of the men were actually taken as prisoners of war and sent down to the United States. So that's why it's mainly women and children, and perhaps a few of the very elderly, very elderly that were left in town. So many of the folks, you know, they frantically tried to take as many belongings as they could out of their homes. And in terms of the burning of Niagara, they were left in, you know, it was snowing, it was cold, it was, you know, December is when the burning happened. So what actually ended up happening when, you know, the fire and the flames were up in Niagara, people on the outskirts saw the flames and decided to come into town, and a lot of those individuals ended up helping people and taking them into their homes out in the township area. Some people took shelter in root houses that were on the outskirts again of town, and even the Henry family that was located at the lighthouse took in people and their belongings as well, as much as they could fit into the lighthouse and to their home right beside it. So in terms of the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, there were a few places that were left untouched, and one of those would have been the lighthouse. That was not destroyed, and the home beside it. Of course, you know, the lighthouse is very important for sailors on the US and the Canadian or British side. So of course they did not want to tear that down. And parts of St. Mark's survived. The gunpowder magazine at Fort George survived. And so this research and me saying this comes from Joy Ormsby, who I had a really great relationship with, a researcher here. And she did a lot of research into the homes after the War of 1812. And she and I, you know, always talked about this. And so from the research that she did, there were two homes that survived. One was the Clench home, and the other was another home on Johnson. So the Clench home, you know, there's quite a stately home that's there today, but unfortunately, a couple of years after the war, sometime I think in the 1820s, there was a spark from a wash. They were lighting a fire to heat up the water for washing laundry, and the spark actually leads to the home being burned down. And so this comes through a letter that was written in 1823, and they say, unfortunately, in the month of February 1820, the house I then lived in with my family was accidentally burnt down, and we lost the whole of it. And the other house, which I didn't get a chance to get the exact location on Johnson Street before the talk. I was working on this. It's been a busy week with the Minister of Heritage coming this week, surprisingly. So the other home was on Johnson Street, and it was actually torn down, to my knowledge from Joy's research, in the 1900s, probably early 1900s. And it was simply that the town and the homeowners were unaware of its history and that it survived. So there's that. So the other thing is, of course, so St. David's is a place that is burned down as well. And there is a couple of places there that survive. And unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have pictures of these places, but it's some of the places are Solomon Quick's Tavern, the Grist Mill at 137 4 Mile Creek, 215 4 Mile Creek, 46 Paxton Lane, and 290 4 Mile Creek Road are some of the places that were left untouched. And so St. David's also experienced a burning, and of course I would only assume that you know, people on the outskirts of the town would have came to their aid and help them to get as many belongings out or to find shelter afterwards, which was very common. Anyone who is interested in doing research on the properties and what people owned, we do have copies of the war compensation claims that people submitted following the war. These are held at the Library and Archives Canada, and they're on microfilm at the library. But Peter Babcock, who's a volunteer here, went through all the microfilm for us and actually transcribed the war compensation claims, which is quite a task. And so we have them typed up. We have copies here. And the other spot you could find them is on the website called NiagaraEveOfWar.ca, although those ones mostly focus on Old Town, but we do have we have it for the township and for St. David's Queenston and so on. So this one's about Irish immigrants coming to Niagara-on-the-Lake, and we actually have quite a bit of research on the Irish immigrants that came. Now, most of them didn't come over as indentured labor in the 1850s. A lot of the Irish came over in the 1830s, and then, of course, in the late 1840s, when you get the famine, the major famine hit between 1845 and 1846. You know, they've got the potato crop failure. So, you know, they boarded ships and started heading towards North America, and some of them ill already on the way. It's quite a sad story to do any research into the Irish immigration into Canada, but it's also very interesting. And a lot of them would then land at Grosse Ile in along, you know, the St. Lawrence River, which, if you ever get an opportunity, it is owned by Parks Canada, and I really enjoyed going there and learning about immigration history. I enjoy immigration history myself, so I would encourage you to go to Grosse Ile if you ever get the chance. So they would have come there, and people were prepared for them to process them a bit, but then they would continue down the river, and a number of them actually arrived here in Niagara. And the town council at the time was known as the Board of Police, and so they actually appointed a Board of Health. This was the first sort of Board of Health that happened here in Niagara, and the Canadian government would pay any of the expenses, apparently, that were incurred. So we do have the minute books of the Board of Health here that record the names of physicians and nurses and druggists and the grave diggers, unfortunately, for those who might have passed away, because a number were buried at St. Vincent de Paul Church, one or two at St. Andrews, and others maybe at St. Mark's as well. And so a lot of the community came together to raise funds and find food and clothing for the Irish immigrants that were coming in. The earliest date that we have in the minute book is for June 15th, 1847. And so they start the Board of Health. They start planning for how they're going to process these new immigrants. They appoint an inspector of immigrants who's called Beaver Bonner, and he essentially visits all the steamboats that arrive and gets verbal reports on their condition and what they need and if they're planning to work here. A number of them, people passed away. So they had a couple quarantine buildings where the immigrants would go into, the Irish immigrants, and then once they were cleared, they could leave. And anyone who, you know, they were given money from the local government, but anyone who didn't plan on working wouldn't receive any support or funding. So they were really trying to encourage the Irish immigrants to find work here in whatever way they could. And when you look at some of the census records, a lot of Irish people do end up staying here, and they work for the town. They're laborers. They settle an area known as the Irish Town. And that's over near past John Street, Charlotte Street, back there, actually Green Street and Niagara, over in that area where the Rye House used to exist. That's over where the Irish Town was. And, you know, then there are a number of Irish immigrants that kind of become quite notable. There's Patty Miles, who did the Patty Miles Express, and so on. So anyone who's interested in that history, we do have the minute books that they could look into. And then that's for the 1840s. Unfortunately, the immigrants that came in the 1830s, there's not as much information. So as I said, a lot of them did come with the famine rather than coming as indentured labor, but they were asked to work here, or they wouldn't have received any government support. I'm not sure where in Ireland they all came from. I mean, they would have brought any belongings that they would have had. There might be more in the minute books about that, but I didn't get an opportunity to take a look at that. So was there an amusement park plan for the dock area? This is very interesting because I was doing research prior to COVID about the dock area in anticipation of our exhibition called All Along the Waterfront, and never came across this, funny enough, but we do have this letter in our collection about the Canada Steamship Lines planning an amusement park down in the dock area. So they acquired the land from the Niagara Harbor and Dock Company. And so it transferred ownership in about 1913. And then they indicate to the town that they're going to plan it as an amusement park, which is no surprise. In the 1920s, they would have done that. They were likely trying to capitalize on the major tourism that was existed in the 1910s and at the beginning of 1920s. They were probably capitalizing on the tourists that were coming to Queen's Royal Hotel, which was, just down the river a bit, at Queen's Royal Park today at the end of King Street. But as you can see from the date of this letter, it's 1927. The Depression hits in 1929 is really the start date of that, and the Queen's Royal Hotel really ends around that time as well. So it's no surprise that this didn't move any further. There is some research at Brock University, special collections on it. They have a film that talks a bit about this, and it was in my list of things to go and research before COVID. So I'll have to wait till things open up and I can convince David Sharon to let me in and see what I can see for the research there. But a very interesting history that a lot of people don't know about. So the Potter's Field, so anyone who doesn't know about, what a Potter's Field is, it's a section of a church that is usually for unmarked graves, for paupers and, the undesirables of the community. And so St. Vincent de Paul section of it, the person that asked this question listed a few people. One of those was James Moreau, and he commanded a group of Mackenzie rebels during the 1837 rebellion, and he was buried in the Potter's Field of St. Vincent, so he has an unmarked grave there. There's also, this person who sent in the question had included a gentleman named Patrick Lawless, who was the night watchman of the ship, the Zimmerman, but he's, I think, near the area, but he does have a cemetery stone, so I wouldn't consider him being specifically put into the Potter's Field. But there is another man that is possibly in there. It's an Irishman named Thomas Brennan, who was found guilty of murdering Mary O'Connor of Queenston in 1848. So this is actually during the Irish immigration time period, which is interesting. So it'd be nice to research a bit more into that. And it's believed that there might be victims of the ship's fever, which is typhus, who came over on these ships. So these Irish immigrants, it's very possible that a number of those were buried there as well. This is a very common question that we get at the museum, and a debate and things that I see on social media of Chautauqua Hotel versus the Queen's Royal Hotel, and some confusion in between them. So, so Chautauqua, which is the one at the top there, was a resort of sorts, which was really academic led, and that one is the one that burned down in 1909, and one of the servants apparently left their curling iron, I think it was, out, and it's a frame building, and so it went up in flames very quickly, and people were falling out of the windows or the galleries that you see there, balconies, and trying to jump out and survive the fire. So it went up very quickly at that's Chautauqua there at the top. That was located over near the Chautauqua area of town, along the river there, or along the lake. So the Queen's Royal Hotel is the picture at the bottom. That actually closed down in 1929. So if anyone doesn't know where that was located, essentially near, Queen's Royal Park is today, along the river there, the mouth of the river. And they closed down because they were behind on their taxes. they weren't doing as well in the late 1920s, and they had to sell off the building, sell off everything inside, and that's why you find in some homes today that they've got things from the Queen's Royal Hotel there, and you know, they've got a door or a chest or something like that, so it's from the Queen's Royal Hotel. And so essentially the town then sold off parts of the property, which is where you see along Front Street there's some more modern-ish homes, which modern in Niagara is, you know, anything that's built after, you know, the 1800s, because we have so many heritage homes. So they sell off those properties, and so those are built with homes. The hotel is torn down, and you also have Queen's Royal Park that is developed there too. So this is, actually I drive by this home every once in a while when the bridges are up, because I live in St. Catharines, and I was always curious about it as well. So this one I got a bit of information actually from the town, who had some info here. So it was built by George Bowles in circa 1900s, and the builder used the fieldstone from, you know, the surrounding farm to construct the home. And it's possible that the entire parcel of land was can be dated back to 1797 in terms of the owners, with the Crown grant being given to a Peter McBride. So there were various key features. That there is you know, features along the corners of the building and around the windows, show some beautiful stonework. There used to be a why can I not think of the word today? Balcony or a veranda around the outside. And apparently there used to be some stained glass in the front window as well, but you don't see it. So I took these pictures today actually on my way in so you can see it, but it'd be great to know a bit more of that history, I'm sure, for all of us to know, because it really is a beautiful home. So hopefully it isn't, you know, no demo by neglect or anything like that. It's quite a stunning home. So next we have the curator questions. So these ones aren't as easy for photos or anything visually exciting. So what does the curator do? Well, I mean, have you seen Indiana Jones? Because my job is that exciting. I'm just joking. I do digging in the archives here when I have time, and it's my absolute favorite time is when I get to do research. That's my favorite thing to do. So curators do the research and interpretation of the collection for the most part. They work on the exhibitions, they manage the collection, the additions and accessions, especially in small organizations. When you get into a larger organization, they do have specific collections managers and such that, you know, they're completely dedicated to the collection. So here we have a smaller staff, and so you know, the curator does collections as well as the interpretation and research of the collection. Fortunately here we were able to hire on an assistant curator who can help me with a lot of that as well, which is really great. We do a lot of research. And then in my managing director role, you know, I'm working with the board about the strategic directions of the organization, looking after the buildings, overseeing the operations and the programs and such as well. But I also shovel snow, and I install the hand sanitizer stations, and I sweep, and I change light bulbs. And I must say, it's a very glamorous job. And I know a lot of people say, oh, you're a curator. Oh, that's so exciting. And it's like, yes, it is. It definitely is. It's a lot of fun to be a curator. But I mean, I'm also doing the shoveling and, you know, various small jobs like that don't seem so glamorous. But that's what happens when you work in a small museum. And I must say, I do enjoy working in a small museum because of the variety of work that you get to do. So what type of schooling do you need in order to be a curator? Well, interesting enough, a lot of the curators that I talk to all seem to come from different backgrounds. So, you know, way back in the day, there weren't as many museum field programs as there are today. But in terms of my own path, I personally did an honor specialization in politics and history. And then I did a master's in public history at University of Western Ontario, which is a program that looks at how history, the academic end of history, can be brought to the public forum, and how you have to change. And so you focus on digital history and museums and archives and theory, as well as the practical together. So it was a really great program. I really enjoyed that. And then with that program, I had an internship, which I actually did here. So I was a student here first. And then, it was a great way to get into the museum field here in Niagara and to really get to know all the different organizations. So then I worked at other museums as well. But today there's a public history program that people can look at. There's a few universities that offer that. There are museum programs. I think Algonquin and Fleming do a couple of those as well. There's maybe a few others. So you can, for those students that asked that, I know there were some Brock students that asked questions about these types of things. There's also the Ontario Museum Association offers a certificate course that does a number of museum type courses. So those will help. Yeah. So what motivated me to become a museum curator? Good question. I never thought about going into museums before, but the year that I graduated from university, I wanted to travel, and my parents forced me to apply to programs because they didn't want me to end there. And so I applied to a number of programs. I did my LSATs and tried that, thought about that venue as well, becoming a lawyer. And while I was living in Ireland, I got accepted to the public history program at Western. So I decided to come home and go to that program. And that program included museology, and I got the opportunity to be exposed to working with collections. It was a medical collection at Western, and I absolutely loved it and really embraced that, and started working here and really enjoyed the staff and the collection, and felt very lucky and was very excited and sort of embraced it, and then kept applying to jobs and luckily got them. So yeah, it's been really great. The next question, how long does it take to create an exhibit in the museum, and what is the process? If you're in a large museum, it probably takes a year. And if you have that time, that's excellent. For us and for me, I usually start, like 6 months would be the farthest out, but a lot of the real work takes place closer, maybe 3 months out or so. And a lot of the process is figuring out what the mandate of the exhibition will be, who's the audience, what are the various topics, sort of exploring the themes of what you could talk about, kind of a brainstorming session, and then looking at how you can tell those stories through artifacts. And here, we're very lucky that our collection is very strong, and I don't often have to get pieces in for displays. But also, we don't do a lot of traveling exhibitions, and part of that is because we are restricted in our budget. We are a small museum, and so we don't have crazy budgets, because traveling exhibits can cost 10 grand, 20 grand. And so, we can't afford that necessarily, because they only come in for a few weeks or a couple months. And we like to do 2 exhibits a year. So one is essentially a summer exhibit, and one is a winter exhibit. And so then, we find the artifacts and plan out the displays and write the text and get panels printed, and then the fun part of actually installing the exhibit is really great to do. So yeah, I do really love doing exhibitions. What is my favorite area of research? Oh, there's so many. But I will say, for the sake of this, is probably the War of 1812 was my favorite to research. I like military history, but I like the domestic side of the military history. So not, the troop formations or, the battle tactics. I like to know what were the regular folks doing during that, while the soldiers were coming through town. Who were the people that were living here, and what were they doing, and what happened to them? What's their story? So I like to look at the domestic side of military research often. But I have other areas of research. There's a lot of things in our collection and our history that I am dying to dig in and research when I get the time, and learn more about and communicate that history out to our public as much as I can. if I could do an exhibit about something that you haven't already, what would it be? Well, the All Along the Waterfront exhibit is something I've been wanting to do for several years. It's been in my mind for several years. So I'm very excited about that one to come out now next year. But some of the other things I'd really like to work on doing major displays are Indigenous history, sort of public services like the firefighters and the police services, the houses. I'd like to do one on the houses in town because there's so many beautiful heritage homes. And another one is sort of the criminals and the ugly underbelly of Niagara, and to look at that history and doing a display on that would be really fun, I think. But sometimes the struggle and the restrictions of those topics are sometimes what can you use to tell the story. So they might not be fitting for a major exhibition, but they could be fitting for digital exhibitions or sort of a smaller displays for smaller display cases. How are you able to convey what most people view as boring history as something interesting that grabs people's attention? This question makes me laugh. Because I understand there's things in history that could be seen as boring, but I think sometimes it has to do with what is the person who's presenting it and their passion. So if you have a passion for a certain type of whatever you're trying to communicate, I think the person who's listening to you can see your passion and your excitement, and they like to learn that way. I think the other thing is trying to connect the history to them. So why is it relevant to them and why is it important? And I think if you can grab onto that in the stories that you tell, that certainly helps. And I think a lot of people learn through comedy in a way, and through theatrical presentations. And that's why I've really enjoyed when we get to do theatrical presentations for our programming that associates with the exhibitions or history that we're trying to get across to our community. I think a lot of people learn that way, especially those who don't have an interest in history already. Those individuals who think history is boring, that the shows really do help to get at least a little bit of interest in there for them too. So this is, sorry, I'm going to move my thing here because it's kind of blocking my text here. So there are over 53,000 items in our collection, and a majority of that collection is stored here on site. We have 3 storage spaces, 1 for archival and 2 for objects. There are a few things that are not stored here on site, mostly because of their size, or sometimes there's things that relate to other history. So there are a couple artifacts that are at the courthouse. There are a couple that are on display there. There are a couple items that are stored with Parks Canada because we don't have the room to store them here, such as the Servos sleigh. So eventually, hopefully with our capital project, we'll be able to bring those artifacts home, especially the oversized ones, and give them somewhere to live and to tell their stories too. When did the way the museum displays everything, the way they used to be, how does it look like now today in comparison? When did it change? Good question. And I don't have the exact answer for you for that. I did study sort of the history of museums in my undergrad, and you'll ask the staff today, I was like, where are my old books of, when I can get the dates? But my guess would be probably around the 1970s or 60s or so, they probably started clearing things out a bit more, probably the turn of the century is my guess. So this is actually an interesting picture. This shows, they're different angles, but the black and white picture shows Memorial Hall facing towards the front door, and the more recent image, although not completely recent, but shows the way we display today with things spaced out. So our museum was set up as that cabinet of curiosity with everything kind of thrown in everywhere, chock full. But of course, part of that is probably because they didn't have space. And later on in the 1940s, when the high school closes down, the Niagara Historical Society decides to take it over and grow a bit more, and then we continue to grow, and we are hoping to continue to grow into the future. Sorry, I'm just moving the screen so I can see the questions a bit. My face is in the corner there. So we do have an early catalog from 1911, and there are items that are missing from it. What is the most interesting item which you would now like to find and return to our collection? Very good question, Bob, which is tough. I went with the hat worn by Ralph Clench at the opening of the Parliament in 1792 in Niagara. That was apparently donated by Johnson Clench, and can't find it. It could have been traded out of the collection or something way back in the day. We're not sure, but there are a few items that we would love to have here again at the museum. The other would be the Lincoln militia flags. I get asked this question often from, especially people from Guernsey, for the Lincoln militia that was out that way. It says in our early records that we had Lincoln militia flags. Can't find them. They're not here. I don't know if someone from the, one of the old curators might have tried to return it to the Lincoln militia, or a representative group, or to a heritage group in the other communities. I don't know what happened to it, unfortunately. So the next question is, what is one of the strangest or coolest artifacts that someone has offered to donate? I can't say there's been too many strangest artifacts, but one of the coolest things that we got was the Polonia Restituta medal that was given to Elizabeth Asher for her contributions to the Polish during the First World War. This came from St. Mark's. They actually donated it to us during my time here, and I was very excited. You can see the picture here of Elizabeth Asher she's wearing the medal. It's really amazing when you can find, when you get an artifact that, you already have a picture of that artifact, it's in that picture, and so it's been used, it's authentic, and it's really great to have that piece. It's really quite significant, of course, because Elizabeth Asher was the first female and Canadian to receive this medal, and her story is very important, and she will be featured in our Women of Niagara-on-the-Lake publication that will be coming out. We haven't titled it yet, and the exhibition that we're planning this fall to coincide with that publication. And Shauna actually featured her in her talk about some women of Niagara-on-the-Lake, so you can find that on YouTube to learn more about Elizabeth. What is the weirdest artifact in our collection and why? We have a few weird things, actually, but this one is pretty good. It's an amulet with beadwork around it. So it's either an animal foot or a bird foot, and it was donated in 1917. And so it's strange. We don't know what it was used for. I do have records of it coming in the early collection, so I haven't deaccessioned it, of course, because it kind of contributes to the history of our organization and the collecting that used to exist. And it's great, a funny piece, and we had it on display, of course. The other is, we've got hair from the collection and people's hair and things like that. So my favorite artifact that's currently on display in the museum is the coat that you see there. It's the Revolutionary War coat that was worn by the Servos family. Daniel Servos was a lieutenant in the Indian Department in 1779, so it's really a unique piece. You don't find them every day, these Revolutionary War era coats, and so we do have that on display. And two items that we don't have on display is the Laura Secord collection is not on display, and this is what you see here on the screen is the end of sugar tongs, and so it has the initials of LIS, Laura Ingersoll, Secord, and so it's a very unique collection. And we also have a anti-tank gun, which is what you see there, and it's one of my favorite pieces that came in following the First World War. It's one of the war trophies that were taken in. So these anti-tank guns, so tanks were actually created in 1916, and the anti-tank gun was created by the Germans. This is a German anti-tank gun that was taken by Canadians, and so they created this, of course, to answer to the tanks that were being put out by the British, of course. So it's a really neat piece. It's one of my favorites. It's extremely heavy, but it's a great piece. And they're extremely rare, I should say. All of these items, of course, are very rare. The Revolutionary War coat is rare, and the anti-tank gun is rare. You can't find them. I've seen it in one other location down in the States. I got to see it there. Could you explain the meaning of the museum's new logo? Good question. So this logo just came forth. It's red and blue, of course, is the nod to the Union Jack, which is part of our military history here. We can't ignore our strong links to British history here in Niagara. And then we've got the modern font, which is sort of us trying to look ahead and to be modern and be a part of our community and show that museums aren't stuffy old places. Another question that kind of came in there is, what is the difference between the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum and the Niagara Historical Society? So the Niagara Historical Society owns and operates the museum, but they are one in very similar, one in the same. They work together very closely. Before our name was the Niagara Historical Society and Museum. And so the Niagara Historical Society is the legal name and the organization that funds the Niagara-on-the-Lake and runs the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum. And I think that's all the questions that I have, unless Amy has any more. Amy?
I'm not seeing any questions here. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to send them our way. We always enjoy getting questions from people. We do probably about 200 research requests every year at the museum here, and they come in through email and over the phone, and people walking in. So people are always, you know, wanting to learn more about the town. We get a lot of house research, as Sarah mentioned. She'd love to do an exhibition on the houses. So that's always a big one for people. So if anyone out there has any more questions, or you know, you want to research your house or anything, just get in touch with us, and we're always happy to help you do that. Right now, because of COVID, our research services are kind of suspended right now. We're trying to minimize contact with the collection as much as possible from outside researchers. But we can do some things internally for you, and as soon as we can and it's safe to do so, then we will open up our full research services again. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your talk today. It's really great to hear, you know, some of your favorite things in the collection and what it's like to be a curator and all of that. So thank you very much. We have a break, so next week we won't have a presentation on Thursday, but then we will resume the week after. So you can visit us on nhsm.ca for the list of August presentations. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and have a great day.